All right, well, I'd like to welcome everybody back for the second week of the Ask Us Anything sessions. And what we're going to introduce is a new feature today that we're going to be doing throughout the rest of the courses. We're going to be having a special guest panelist joining us for these AUA sessions. And today we have Marilyn Rusink, who's a faculty member here at Penn State. And Marilyn does a lot of her work on plant viruses, and I thought that she would bring an interesting perspective, given that we don't talk very much about plant disease in the course, though it does come up a little bit later in some of David's lectures. So Marilyn, could you introduce yourself to the group?
Sure. My name is Marilyn Rusink. I've been at Penn State for the last 3 years, and my program really works in virus ecology. So we use not only plant viruses, but also fungal viruses for our work. And unlike a lot of the people here in the Center for Infectious Disease Dynamics, we work on beneficial viruses too. So we're not just focused on viruses that cause disease, excuse me, but we're also very interested in viruses that help their hosts. And that's probably many more than people are aware of. Maybe 1% cause disease, that's my estimate these days, of all viruses.
All viruses, animal and human.
Animal and human, yeah.
Absolutely.
So it's actually quite rare for a virus to cause disease, but all of the research has been focused on that, and I think partly because, well, we're humans. We love bad news. We don't really like good news that much. Right. There are certainly viruses that cause serious diseases in humans, and so we focused on those, and also many viruses that cause serious diseases in plants, and those are important for human health as well, because they can really affect our crops.
Right.
They've been discussed in terms of bioterrorism as well, crop diseases. So, yeah.
And so I thought it would be interesting just to contrast a little bit what's different, or in fact the same, about the epidemiology of plants versus animals. Again, we focus a lot on animals and humans in the course. I know that in my early research career, I got very interested in plant diseases, largely because plants stood still, and I could then study the organisms that transmit disease among plants. And so I was really interested in modeling how insects work as vectors of plants, and the fact that the plant stood still actually made it a lot easier to study that explicit transmission process, rather than in animal systems where you have to be concerned about the movement of the hosts as well as the susceptibility of the hosts. But that's just my perspective. I don't know if you have a more nuanced perspective about what's different with plants.
Well, there are other things that are different. One thing is that plants have cell walls, and so getting a virus into a plant is more complicated than it is. There's no airborne viruses in plants, for example. They don't breathe in viruses. And just to get a plant infected, you have to do something to break the cell wall. Insects do that very well. We can do it in the lab too, just by rubbing the plants but you have to rub them with a little grit, like a little fine sand or something, to break the cell walls and get the viruses in. So that's different. It means that the way they move around is different. And I too think that plants being stationary really helps a lot in terms of doing studies. Another thing, besides being able to see the insects move between plants, is that we can go back and sample the same plant again in the future. So we've been doing that in wild plants, in fact. And because we take a GPS reading and a photograph of every plant we sample, we can go back even several years later and sample the same plant. And in fact, what we see is something that we've never seen in crops, and that is these acute viruses infect plants, and they actually get cleared. And then when we sample them later, they don't have them. In crops, that's never really been described. Usually if a plant gets a virus, that's it. It's going to die, or people will just call it out to get rid of it, to prevent spread. So that's another advantage, I think, in doing epidemiology, is that you can go back and resample. If you're sampling wild animals, that's pretty hard to do. I think it's done, but but it's not as easy as just walking up to a plant and taking another sample 5 years later, and getting the same thing. So.
Right. One of the things that I've always been struck with is the focus on the difference in the focus between infection and disease in crop systems versus animal systems. In human health, we worry a whole lot about treating disease as well as treating infection. But in a lot of the crop world, we often don't necessarily care whether or not a plant is infected with a virus or something, because it very often can't harm us per se. Right. But we spend a lot of time worrying about whether or not that virus is going to cause disease, because that disease can cause discoloration, disfiguration, things that are going to make crops look unpalatable, right, and not sell on the shelf. So there's actually a real specific focus on the distinction between infection and disease.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's really true, and I think we could actually use that in some way to our advantage if we had a better understanding, because plants are mobile, and the way I think of it is often the plants don't sneeze, they rely upon these insect vectors to get disease from one place to the other. And we don't really care if they have a disease or an infection sometimes, because we don't have to worry in the same way we'd worry about animal models or certainly humans. So I think we can use these different components to our advantage in having better ways to deal with infections in agricultural systems. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really important. So one really good example is cassava, which has picked up infections from local African plants. So it's come from South America, introduced to Africa. It's got two really important viral diseases. And so we need to understand how it gets in, how you see the demonstration of disease on the animal, on the plant and from which animal it comes from, and then how might we control that. I think we can use these various elements which are peculiar to plants, hopefully to our advantage.
So given the fact that the transmission is so different, this very interesting that you can't breathe and suck it in versus the relative importance of vectors in plants, does that affect the whole community of parasites and pathogens associated with plants? So you may have, for example, more fungi, you may have less nematode worms, you don't have tapeworms, you might. Does it affect the whole community? Or?
Well, yeah, it does, I guess, because they have to be able to, for example, you don't get really long distance transmission very easily in plants, whereas you might, things aren't born on the wind. Well, in fact, the insects can be.
The vectors, yeah.
The vectors can be. But I think
So I jump in there, and so I work in cacao in West Africa, which again is a South American plant introduced to West Africa. It's inherited some insect pests which suck the juice from the plant. They inject a virus which has come from a rainforest tree, and those insects are tended by ants, which build a carton of soil around them in which we find water mold, which is like a fungus.
Yes.
So we have four partners which normally wouldn't interact with together. And it really screens ecology and it really demands that the ecology jump in there to understand all this. But absolutely, it's a really interesting ecosystem playing out disease there.
Yeah, and I guess it's sort of the limited. Every plant is its own ecosystem in a sense, so it's interacting with all these things. And fungi, I mean, you couldn't find a single plant, even out here, probably in the garden, that's not colonized by a fungus. Plants and fungi go together, and most of them, again, are beneficial. Plants never would have. It's been millions of years that they've been together. That's how plants got onto land, by taking the fungi up into their system. So, but then again, fungi can cause disease. Fungi can also vector viruses. Parasitic plants can vector viruses, so there are other things besides insects. Nematodes are very good vectors for some viruses as well. And there are lawnmowers are a really good vector for some viruses too. So there is the mechanically, or even grazing animals can carry a virus from one plant to another.
Great.